we have the main hour here. I want to thank you all very much for coming out on such a rainy day here to join us for the first Museum Midday of our season. So in celebration of Alaska Book Week, we chose this book, Our Way of Parallel History, as our pick for Ketchikan Museums as our Alaska Book Week pick. So we're very excited to be joined by Julie Cajune and Norma Shorty. So I'll hand things over to them for them to introduce themselves.
Hello. Halt. Good day, everyone there. Julie Cajune, East West. Chines Gaelic, I am Salish. Chines Anishinaabe. I am Ojibwe on my father's side from White Earth, but I grew up with my mother's relatives, my Salish relatives in northwestern Montana, and on the land where we have always been. We are a tribal nation that is fortunate to have reserved a reservation that is part of our original homeland, our Aboriginal territory. And so everywhere I look, there are coyote stories where coyote and fox went through our homeland, making it ready for us. So I live in a beautiful country. Today we say ches halt, good day, but a long time ago, I would say stemplu ul as buus. And that's how we used to greet one another. And that means what is in your heart. And I think that's a more beautiful greeting. But I want to tell you that I'm happy, Chines Lempty, Hiafwasket. I am very happy today that this book has finally been birthed. It was a long time waiting. I won't tell you how long, and I'm particularly happy to be here with Norma, who is a contributing author. And I want to just tell you a really quick story and introduce myself by my work, because I don't consider myself an academic. I have been a classroom teacher, and my first teaching job was in a bilingual program with 420 K through 4 students on my home reservation in a public school. And I worked with 2 fluent Salish speakers. I am not a fluent speaker of my language, but working with those speakers with 400 kids and trying to create lessons and things to do, I ended up becoming a student really of my own history. And I grew up in a pretty involved political family. So I knew a lot of our political history. I had relatives that were on the tribal council, and I knew some general things, but when I started learning more about our language and working with speakers, it really set me on a path to become a student of who my relatives are, who my Salish relatives are in our land, our homeland outside the reservation, and place names and territory and all the stories there. And so that kind of set me on a path outside of the classroom. And I ended up working for my tribe, developing materials, because I don't know, in Alaska, there are perhaps more things available for teachers. But here in Montana, if you want to teach about any of the Montana tribes, like for me starting to teach, there wasn't a book or a curriculum or anything. So I was making things up and talking to people and gathering plants and doing, creating my own materials. So it really kind of started me on a path to produce things like that. And I got inspired by some of the stories that I happened upon that were either told to me from people in the community or shared through writings or old videotapes that had been done. Our tribe has an archival library of hundreds of audio tapes, and some of you might be my age, where you remember the old cassette tapes that you sat on a table, and you put the little cassette tape in there and you hit record. Well, some of our elders were quite visionary, and they started gathering and recording everything that they could think of that they thought was important, because they could see that a lot of our stories were getting lost. And so we have this beautiful archive of our history and our stories in our language on audio tapes. But as I started going through some of this material, I felt happy, but I was also sad, because I thought that those stories would have really shaped me as a young person, that they would have shaped my worldview. And I think they would have helped me be stronger in knowing more of my history and the remarkable brilliance and agency of my ancestors and relatives. And so I really became committed to see that young people in my community and in our schools have an opportunity to access that material. So I started producing small books and different things. And through that work, I was contacted by the Kellogg Foundation, and I started working with tribes in Montana through the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I've done a lot of collaborative work with other tribes. And so through that work, the Kellogg Foundation heard about it through an obscure magazine article that probably no one has ever looked at. And they called me and expressed their interest in supporting this work, which was surprising to me. So there was a program officer, Wilan Yang Kren, a Chinese American. When she became a citizen, somebody gave her Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. And she was stunned that more Native history wasn't included in the master narrative of US history. And so then she read this article and said, oh, look, there's an Indian woman in Montana who's trying to do some of this. So that's kind of how all of this came to be. So they invited me to submit a grant, which I did. And they funded work producing some materials. And one of the first things I thought about was doing an anthology for not just my tribe or Montana, but to look at something for all of the Native people in the United States, and particularly including Hawaii and Alaska, because in a lot of the books that I accessed as a teacher, trying to find other tribal histories, it's like the lower 48 states and Alaska and Hawaii were often absent from those stories and narratives. And our stories, our political histories sometimes are quite different. And so I was a particular interest to include those. And I also had the good fortune as a teacher to have met a wonderful person from Alaska, Oscar Quigley. And Oscar was here in Montana several times, and I was at other conferences. And I learned a lot from Oscar in every time that I met him. And I was doing a lot of teacher training at that time, because I don't know how it was for you guys when you went to school. And I wish I was there with you, because I'm a teacher and I would like to engage you in activities. And I would ask you what you learned about Native people when you went through school. What did you learn in grade school? What did you learn in high school? Did you read a book by a Native author? What do you think about identity as being a US citizen? What do you think about the identity of our country and how that is shaped and all of that? So but I was doing a lot of training with teachers, and to be honest, I felt like I kept doing the same things over and over. I don't know that I was being terribly effective in changing their practice. What I found is that teachers just wanted me to come to the classroom and teach the content. And I can't do that. I can't go all around. And so I was trying to encourage them, but they were very insecure and they were afraid of doing something wrong. And I understand that, because sometimes if we do something wrong, it's, people hold us accountable and it's not a great experience, but we're all learning, right? And so Oscar and I talked a lot about that, about working with teachers. He talked about working with teachers in Alaska so that they would have more knowledge of where they lived, of the people, of the land, of what subsistence living was like there. And he shared what they were doing here by having teachers go to fish camps. And it was so brilliant and so powerful. And it changed my understanding and how I worked with teachers. And so when I got the grant to do this book, I immediately thought about Oscar and inviting a contribution from him. I had purchased his book and read it. And unfortunately, when I invited Oscar's contribution, I was grieved to learn that his health was failing at that time. So his colleague, Ray Barnhart, shared a chapter that Oscar had published in a journal, in an American Indian Education journal. And that chapter is in the book's first section, called Treasure. And so I hope that by including Oscar's piece in this book, that a broader audience benefits from Oscar's knowledge and thoughts and his humanity. And so I wanted to do a remembrance of Oscar and how he impacted me. And since he was one of the Alaska authors, and there's a remembrance for Oscar at the end of the book. So, but also through Ray Barnhart, I found out about the wonderful work that Norma Shorty was doing. And then through other Native colleagues, I found Alicia Drabreck and Jeannie Brenig. And so there are actually quite a few contributions from Alaska, and there are quite a few from Hawaii. And I ended up having some people from Hawaii actually come to Montana. And so that's kind of the story of how this book came to be. And then people contributed thousands of pages, and obviously that 1,000 pages, and there were several thousand. That is way too big a book. I don't know if I could hold you guys captive through that. So we ended up with about 360 pages, and it was hard. It was very hard, but I really wanted Alaska and Hawaii to stand out, but I also wanted to share stories with folks like you that maybe you haven't heard. There's a Native journalist, Joe Whittle, who shares the story of being raised with a father who was Indian and a mother who was not, and they divorced, and then he was separated from his Indian community, and kind of his journey back and kind of reclaiming his identity. And it's a very personal, intimate story. It's sometimes painful to read, but it's joyful in the end. And so I was looking in particular for stories like that, also for stories of agency. I'm not sure what books you have read or materials you've read about Native people, but often I find that we are presented as a victim. All of these bad things happen to us. And while some bad things have happened to us, it ignores the brilliance and agency and vision of our ancestors and relatives. And that agency, vision, and brilliance is why we persist today, specifically as Salish people, as Kalispel people, Sanka people. Those are the tribes on my reservation. And so I wanted to share stories that showed how Native people were proactive and active forces in our lives, people's lives. So those were my really big intentions. And then I wanted to, of course, include I didn't want to start with contact and colonization. I wanted to include a section that really talked about our worldview, who we are, how we see ourselves in the world, and to present that's not in the past, but that's still who we are today. We are still those people today, and that knowledge persists. And so the first section of the book is called Treasure, and those book sections were determined when we gathered here. So I gathered most of the scholars here. Unfortunately, I did not have Norma for 3 summers, and we sat and prayed and talked about what would be important stories to share. And so I felt like this book is a true collaboration. It was an invitation and a collaboration and a labor of love. So I think that you'll find the stories perhaps unique and original to what you've read. Some of them will be familiar. Donald Grindy writes a lot about federal Indian policy, but I included a lot of human stories about how that policy affected nations and people. So I would like to let you visit with Norma, since she is a person who's closer to your homeland. And I know that just my zooming in there, I'm a guest amongst thousands of years of history and many people that are there with you in your beautiful state. And I have had a few opportunities to be there a few times, but not enough to really know a lot, but enough to appreciate the beauty and the magnificence of the landscapes that you live in. So I am going to turn this to Norma. And thank you, Lam Lamps, Yepan Lam Lamps, Husuketh Kukani, Norma. Thank you for being with us today and going on this journey with me.
Thank you. Oh, masa iati. You katuasak yaskechon tukasa ganahari shawat ayakat kokatan hit with tsu. My community is Teslin, Yukon. I live in Canada and I'm a Tlingit. And I live on the Grease Trail. So I think, that where I come from, we don't acknowledge the borders because the borders have separated our families. And so much so that, like my contribution to this book is from the perspective of being a Canadian, a colonized Indigenous Canadian, and acknowledging that, again, that those boundaries that were put in place are not ours. They were not something that we constructed as Indigenous folks. So I really appreciated, Julie, your introduction to who you are, and in fact, how I kind of got involved in this project. It's true that I was in grad school at the time. And 2016 was the year that I graduated, actually. And this is when my work was submitted to Julie. So it was kind of even before, I think I gave you my work way before then, because looking at it now, I'm sort of seeing where I was as I was doing my research. And so what my work is really unpacking the knowledge around my mother's clan. And so those of you in the audience might wonder, well, how in the heck, could she not know? But one doesn't have to go far back into the history of contact and colonization to understand the deep impacts and effects on Indigenous peoples. And even for someone like me, who is, an emerging elder, and someone who doesn't know my Tlingit language very well, but I'm learning it. So I'm an emerging speaker. It's thinking about all of those things and sort of needing to understand, why did I have to do research on who am I? I found that to be a very helpful process as far as indigenizing our history, um, and in unpacking, loaded English words like story, like tradition, um, and recognizing that English and Western ways of being have oppressed Indigenous folks, um, and as well that oppression has only meant that we've come out sideways. So we're still here. We haven't gone away, and that our understanding of who we are is deeply embedded in our history. Um, so it's understanding that it is our history, and understanding the power of the English words and English contexts and constructs. So thinking even about the word narrative, because we always refer to our Indigenous stories as being narratives. Those aren't narratives. That's our oral history. And the narrative about that is the use of the word narrative, which actually oppresses that whole idea of history. And so, that's kind of who I am. I'm an Indigenous researcher scholar. I work for Yukon University. I have an affiliation with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm on many students' grad committees, which I absolutely love that work. I teach teachers how to teach. And in this teaching of teaching, it's really to empower my students with the knowledge of colonization and taking it further than sort of the mission school. So looking to each aspect of colonization, and not just in Canada, but Alaska and the US as well. And so, knitting that whole story together to kind of give my students the feeling of why they would like to make a change. And so, in that making a change, what is needed from people? And it is these testimonies, these oral histories, these ways of knowing that are published and produced by our own people. And so I'm really hoping that, um, that this book is going to be able to be used by educators, to help students understand, various aspects of being Indigenous, and especially for our own Indigenous folks to realize that they can make a life from being Indigenous, that they can, write stories, histories, and that our way of knowing and being is very, very important, in this way of being in today's world. So as an educator, I get to sit at government tables. I get to sit on the indigenization committee for the Yukon University. And in that, looking to literacy frameworks and seeing that it's more than just what's written in books, but when we indigenize that, it's the petroglyphs, it's the shapes on face paints, it's audio clips, it's oratory, it's the stories that are told through our headwear and our clan shirts, and our face paints. So it's so much more than just that Western way of looking at indigeneity. So I guess in a very long way, that is in essence who I am. I am a grandmother. I have one granddaughter. She is going to be 2 years old on November the 12th. Her name is Slasai, which is incredible. That's what her name means. Yeah, I'm very blessed to have that, because I think, the philosophy that we have as Indigenous people is that we tell our stories our history so that our children are not strangers on their land, and so that our great grandchildren are not tourists on their land. And so this is the essence of what we do. We lay these stories down so that our children will never forget where we come from, and are able to make, deep connections to prehistory, because often our timelines often start at the time of contact and colonization. And we as Indigenous peoples, it's our duty to bring in the pre-contact history and stories to make sure those are also viewed with the same kind of reverence that Western history is looked at with. So anyway, that's a long way of introducing myself. Sorry, but thank you, Julie. Back to you, but you're on mute.
She's a good moderator too. That was a very good introduction. And I appreciated reading Norma's writing, but we met actually on the telephone, and which is a weird way to meet someone, but there was something that happened, so the spirits aren't limited sometimes by the physical limitations. And when Norma and I met on the phone, I don't know, I can't explain it. Anyway, it was very good, and I was in deep admiration of her work, and related to it also because we are here in my community, we have less than 40 fluent speakers of our language, and there are Salish dialects all the way to the Pacific coast. But as you move out, then I can't understand anything. So most of our speakers are elders. We have a school, and I was working at our language school when I got this grant. So we're trying to reteach our language, but there's a lot of reteaching and reclaiming going on in Indian country. But I think stories are powerful, and I just want to reiterate what Norma said about how important it is for us to know our stories. And when I was working with kids and looking for things and thinking what I wanted to share with them, I'd come upon a story and go, oh my gosh, I wish I had known this, when I was a child. I wish I had heard this story. It would have made a difference in my life. And so I think stories, for me, it's how we make sense of the world. I don't know. I wish I could ask you guys out there in the room how you make sense of the world, or how you're finding meaning for your life, or your own family, or the stories that you hold. I always like to ask people, if you could only tell one or two stories within your family, what would those stories be? What are some of the most important stories of your family? I'm from a very matriarchal family, so I often, when I work with kids, ask them a story about a yaya or a kena or a tupia, a woman in their family, a kaha, an auntie. So think about your own family and your own family history, and how that connects and grounds you and builds your identity, with who you are, and how each of you there see your place in the world, how you fit in the world, how you fit in where you are. How did you come to be where you are at Ketchikan? I mean, I would like to know those stories. If I was there with you in the room, I would ask you, and I want to know that. But I find that through sharing stories, we make meaning, and then we make connections with each other. And so it's been a beautiful journey, and every story shared with me was a gift, and I felt like an honor, and it's bearing witness, and I think that's so important, and I'm thinking of a writer who said, this isn't a silent movie. Our voices will save our lives. And I believe that. And I think that that's a time for our country right now. and I probably should not go down that road, but I'm just thinking that it's a time for our country right now for people to give voice to things. And I believe that the stories in this book have a huge contribution to make to our country, to our country's humanity, and integrity. And I believe that, and I believe that there's power in sharing these stories. There are truths and goodness in them, and I think that they go out into the world, and then I believe that something will happen. So I'm still optimistic about that. And elders always tell me, don't worry too much, Julie, because our medicine is still out there. It's still there. And so I like to believe that, and believe that when we share stories with each other, that's what we're doing. And we, in Yopi Out and Making Medicine, that we do that when we share truth and stories with one another as real human beings. And that's what I feel like every author gave in this book. And it was a privilege for me. And so I'm not certain if there is an opportunity for you guys to ask questions or to engage with us. I feel funny doing all this talking.
We've unmuted us here in the audience space, so if you all are willing to take some questions, we can totally have that dialogue.
Absolutely.
All right, well, do we have any questions from the audience in person or online? I know there's some Zoom participants too. All right, I think one question I have for you, Norma, the chapter in the book that you produced here, it seems like it's just the one chapter of the entirety of your dissertation. So can you, going into the research that you did, can you give advice for someone who's starting to look into and researching their own history? Where do you start? Who do you talk to? And how do you kind of find those resources?
Sure, I'd love to do that. So basically, I think, you have to, with any research, you start with your question. So my question really was about, why did my Aunt Gladys say we were Kokatan say we were Ganachadi when I grew up knowing we were Kokatan? So that was my research question. That question took me down some wonderful, wonderful pathways. So I think the first thing is if you're Indigenous and your mother is still alive, keep her on your arm. That will get you in any door, sitting around any table, and involved and invited to any Indigenous circle. So that's number one, because Tlingit people really honor their mothers. And so if they see you with your mom, they're going to know you're pretty serious about the work you want to do. The second thing, that really helped in my research was because my mom was with me, we were invited to some pretty awesome tables. So these were real ku'ich tables where history was being shared, real ku'ichs where, again, people would get up and talk about who they are. Literature as well. Literature, even though it was mixed up and out of sequence, it still provided crumbs. Of course, my own mother and my own community, and just that expansion of what you consider to be your country. Where do you come from? Because for me, I wondered, how did we get to the inland? I wondered, are we really Tlingit? Because that was being challenged. And when you don't know these things, you can kind of fall victim to that kind of a narrative. And so, those were some of the things that got me through. And of course, validation, that's essentially important. I really had to make sure that what I was writing was connected to Tlingit truth, because I didn't want to have a time later when I might have to throw a party of apology for making mistakes. So it was really crucial, that I only spoke for my clan, only spoke for my family. And so that was kind of what I did. Yeah, I think being open is really essential. Going on the actual field trips if you can plan them. So, and not to worry if things don't make sense, because the first 2 years of my research, none of the stories made sense. Uh, it was like I was an anthropologist coming in and recording stuff, and that was it. So I didn't know the indigenous way of connecting history and connecting the dots. Um, and so, I had to have patience through that. And where the truth finally came through was when I was in Ongoon. It was midnight. And before I kind of turned in for the night, the people that I was being hosted by came over and said, "Be careful of the bears." Um, so, I mean, that freaked me out. But at midnight, I heard this scratching on the door, like a scratch, if you can believe it. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up because I thought, okay, I'm in the country of the bears. They told me to watch out for the bears. And so that's what it was. And so I got really frightened, but I didn't go out and check. There's no TV, no radio, no nothing, because that's on Goon, right? That's how it is there. I had nothing. So all there was on this with me was on the side of my bed, there was a book, a green book that was written by De Laguna. And so in my nervousness, I just it fell open. And I'd been searching for my clan house, Kokatan, Kokatan, Kokatan. Where are you? Usua e Kokatan. My God, if I didn't just open the page on the place where the Kokatan house was. And you see, that is Indigenous research. That is knowing that there are forces beyond us that guide our pathway. And we have to be open and willing to take that. And I was. And I was greatly rewarded by that, because what fell out from that was incredible. So it set me on my journey, of being Dr. Shorty. That's who I am. I work at Yukon University. My students call me Norma. I like being called Norma. The only time I want to be called doctor is if other people in the room are being referred to as doctor. Like if Dr. Tom Thornton was in the room and you all called him Dr. Tom, I'd want to be called Dr. Norma, only for the sake of equity, because I earned that title, and it's so willingly given to someone like him, but not, unwillingly given to someone like me. So it's really about that, about recognizing the value of our work and who we are in today's society. So yeah, thank you for that question about my work.
I have a question, certainly. What caused you to doubt your being Tlingit?
Well, some of the written work were saying because I'm on the Yukon River, that I'm Athabaskan.
Oh,
Yeah, because there is a song about the inland Tlingit that is sung on the coast about Gunana. They call us Gunana, which is stranger. It really refers to that. It's not Athabaskan. Gunana means stranger. It doesn't mean Athabaskan.
and I think we saw a question. So can you, if you can hear Marty, and I know it's also in the chat, but it's a long question, so I'll try to be loud. One of the people on Zoom said, I'm a freshman student at the University of Alaska Southeast, and I'm currently enrolled in an Alaska Native Studies class. And in just the last 6 weeks, I've learned a lot about things that I was never taught in grade school, and even just how much was left out of my required Alaska history class in high school. When reading all these stories and doing your research, what was the most surprising thing you learned? So yeah, for whoever wants to take that one. Who is the most surprised?
I'll let Julie speak only because I just spoke. So
I think we could both say something. I'll just say not surprising, but wonderful things that I found. There was a drawing of a Ponderay Kellyspah woman that I had seen several times that was done in the, mid 1800s. I saw several different drawings of this woman at Quilix, which is like red dress, and but I could never find anything about her. And I kept asking elders, I'd say, what do you know about this woman? I was interested. And so I finally found some writings about her. And she was actually a warrior woman. And she was pretty remarkable. And so she chose that role. She never married. And she did some really remarkable things. And then as an elder woman was a healer. But I was so happy to find threads. Sometimes it's a picture and then you're looking for something else. And so kind of putting these little threads together and finding a fuller story of who she was, what was remarkable to me. And I did a little project, and a friend of mine did a spoken word narrative about her that is an audio project that we produced about all women's stories, because often women are left out of narratives. And so I was specific in looking for women's stories. So I wasn't surprised. I was delighted and elated to find more about her. But one thing, as a Salish person, that in researching place names, I had no idea of the extents of our Aboriginal territory. And I drove around one summer with 2 fluent speakers, just visiting all of these places and taking photographs and recordings of them talking about them, because it's not common knowledge how extensive our Aboriginal territory was, or all of our names, hundreds, thousands of names. And I thought that was important. And so it wasn't, I guess it was something I did not know, how big our land was, our country was, until I started going around and learning about all of our place names. That was wonderful. I know, Norma.
oh, wow. Yeah, thank you, Julie. I guess the most surprising thing for me throughout all of my research is that our stories still exist, and that even though our memories might have gaps, that when we return to our Indigenous way of knowing, which is collectively, then and only then can we fill in those gaps. And so, and this saying of why we do what we do is in fact our philosophy. So our Indigenous philosophy is that we will always prepare our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren for what's coming, and that it shall always be based on our ancestral knowledge. And so I think for me, that was a surprising thing, is that I found my place as an Indigenous woman through my research. Because before, if you can believe it, and I can't believe it now, of how lost I really was. And, that connection was gained by me working with our own Indigenous people and unpacking our own Indigenous language. And in fact, yes, knowing our place names and knowing that our territory extends beyond the US, Alaskan and Canadian borders, Yukon borders. Really, so those are fundamental shifts, in my thinking. And in fact, roots me. So now, when I'm coming to the border and I'm fearful because I have 180 fish to get over, I say, you can't take my fish and you cannot do a thing to me. I've been here and I can tell you how. And so that's what I often do is I carry my little soapbox and get out and inform the border guards of my right as an Indigenous person to do what I do. And so I think those are, really positive things that happen to Indigenous folks who begin to understand the deep way of knowing that our ancestors had and continue to bring them forward to the future. So I think that for me, is surprising in the fact that I didn't think, that how much I would be relying upon Indigenous knowledge to give me that feeling of strength. Thanks.
All right, well, we don't have any more questions on Zoom. And it doesn't look like our audience has anything else to ask you right now. Can you just, your book is available. Are there any other ways that we can follow along with the work that you all are doing professionally, or are there any follows up to this book, or other ways we can plug into the material?
Yeah, I teach at Yukon University. If any of you want to come over and be a student, I teach in the Yukon Teacher Education Program. We do have a sister relationship with University of Alaska. So we are sister campuses. Our doors are open. And I'm also an affiliate with UAF Fairbanks. So if any of you want to do a master's or a PhD program, I can be on your committee. And I'm on several right now. So very happy about that. Yeah, I only want to let the Indigenous people know that there is a life, and, it is in knowing who we are. And, it's good pay. It's good pay as long as you get the right gigs. So I'm encouraging all of the students who are in my classes and all the young folks that I come into contact with, you matter. You matter. And that's all I have to let them know. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we are very appreciative of the time that you all have taken to come and visit us here in Ketchikan, from so far flung and so far away. But thank you so much for your time. We really enjoyed having this as our pick for Alaska Book Week, and I know I'm looking forward to diving deeper into the other essays that I have yet to get to. But thank you all so much for joining us for this Museum Midday.
Good luck, Chief Too, and I hope to come to Ketchikan soon.
Lam lamps, nem es weechtem son, Tessia.
Thank you, thank you. All right, we will end the Zoom meeting there. Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye, Norma.
Bye. I'll let you guys, you can get off. They'll all disappear.
Oh.